Hello, I'm up here. Ooh. Hi everyone, I'm using this big camera up here today, not because I want to show off my roots or lockdown hairstyle. No. I think it's a clearer camera so you can see more, but we're going to be carrying on with our class read. So I thought if I used my clearer camera, then you will hopefully be able to see the text even clearer than my normal camera so that you can follow it along. So giving you a clue, what's our class read at the minute? Shout it out. It's Esio Trot. And we started it last week and we got introduced to the characters. So far we've got Mr. Hoppy. He's quite a lonely old man, isn't he? He lives in a block of flats and they have balconies. And he has one true love in his life. He's a very shy man, quite a lonely man, but he loves his neighbour who lives underneath him here. Can you remember? Can you remember her name? Here we go. That's his neighbour there. This is Mrs. Silver. Now, Mrs. Silver, she has a love too, and her love is her pet tortoise. And her pet tortoise name is Alfie. Now, Mr. Hoppy and Mrs. Silver know each other and they have little chats every now and then, but he's never managed to work out how to properly start something so that they can then fall in love and live happily ever after. But they did find common ground when they got chatting about Alfie, and Mrs. Silver let slip that she would just wish he would grow faster because he's still tiny small, and she says, oh, I wish he was a bit bigger. So that got Mr. Hoppy thinking about a plan to try and get this little tortoise Alfie to grow bigger. So she passed him down, no, he passed her down this little rhyme, and she had to say the words to the tortoise. Now, first of all, it looked like that, and I had a good go at trying to read it, you remember. And then we worked out that the other words are spelt backwards too. Mr. Hoppy said, if you turn them round into human language, they simply say, tortoise, get bigger, come on, tortoise, grow up, puff up, shoot up, spring up, blow up, swell up, gorge, guzzle, stuff, gulp, put on fat, tortoise, put on fat, get on, gobble food. I think we left it there last week. So we're going to start our reading this week from here. But you know what I'm like with all these screens. Hang on, let's just get it so I can make sure that I can see that. There we go, that's better. Right, better for me anyway, probably similar for you. I'm going to carry on the book. We're on page 19. Let me get myself comfortable. You get yourselves comfortable as well. I hope this is better for you. I hope it's clearer for you. Let's just see. We're starting from here, you see. I'm not sure if it is much clearer, to be honest. Mrs. Silver examined the magic words on the paper more closely. I guess you're right, she said. How clever. But there's an awful lot of poos in it. Are they something special? Poo is a very strong word in any language, Mr. Hoppy said, especially with tortoises. Now what you have to do, Mrs. Silver, is hold Alfie up to your face and whisper these words to him 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Let me hear you practice them. Very slowly and stumbling a little over the strange words, Mrs. Silver read the whole message out, loud in tortoise language. Not bad, Mr. Hoppy said, but try to get a little more expression into it when you say it to Alfie. If you do it properly, I'll bet you anything you like that in a few months' time he'll be twice as big as he is now. I'll try it, Mrs. Silver said. I'll try anything, of course I will, but I can't believe it'll work. You wait and see, Mr. Hoppy said, smiling at her. Back in his flat, Mr. Hoppy was simply quivering all over with excitement. Your slave for life, he kept repeating to himself. What bliss! But there was a lot of work to be done before that happened. The only furniture in Mr. Hoppy's small living room was a table and 2 chairs. These he moved into his bedroom. Then he went out and bought a sheet of thick canvas and spread it over the entire living room floor to protect the carpet. Next, he got out the telephone book and wrote down the address of every pet shop in the city. There were 14 of them all together. This was written before the internet. You couldn't just Google it. It took him 2 days to visit each pet shop and choose his tortoises. He wanted a great many, at least 100, perhaps more, and he had to choose them very carefully. To you and me, there is not much difference between one tortoise and another. They differ only in their size and in the colour of their shells. Alfie has a darkish shell, so Mr. Hoppy chose only the darker shelled tortoises for his great collection. Size, of course, was everything. Mr. Hoppy chose all sorts of different sizes, some weighing only slightly more than Alfie's 13 ounces, others a great deal more, but he didn't want any that weighed less. Feed them cabbage leaves, the pet owners told him. That's all they'll need, and a bowl of water. What could he possibly be doing, children, buying all of these tortoises? Look, how many he's got. When he had finished, Mr. Hoppy, in his enthusiasm, had bought no less than 140 tortoises, and he carried them home in baskets, 10 or 15 at a time. He had to make a lot of trips, and he was quite exhausted at the end of it all, but it was worth it. Boy, was it worth it. And what an amazing sight his living room was when they were all in there together. The floor was swarming with tortoises of different sizes. Some walking slowly about and exploring, some munching cabbage leaves, others drinking water from big shallow dishes. They made just the faintest whistling sound as they moved over the canvas sheet. But that was all. Mr. Hoppy had to pick his way carefully on his toes between this moving sea of brown shells whenever he walked across the room. But enough of that. He must get on with the job. What is he planning? All these tortoises. Aha! We saw that was introduced to us when we saw the characters page last week. Before he retired, Mr. Hoppy had been a mechanic in a bus garage, and now he went back to his old place of work and asked his mates if he might use his old bench for an hour or 2. What he had to do now was to make something that would reach down from his own balcony to Mrs. Silver's balcony and pick up a tortoise. This was not difficult for a mechanic like Mr. Hoppy. First, he made 2 metal claws or fingers, and these attached to the end of a long metal tube. He ran 2 stiff wires down inside the tube and connected them to the metal claws in such a way that when you pulled the wires, the claws closed, and when you pushed them, the claws opened. The wires were joined to a handle at the other end of the tube. It was all very simple. Mr. Hoppy was ready to begin. Can you see the claw? That part opens and shuts. Like, hang on a minute, where's my hand? And that's controlled by this bit here. If you push and pull it, it will open or close the tortoise catcher. Where's my hand? A bit like that. very long so it can reach down into the balcony. Here we go. Can you see? Mrs. Silver had a part-time job. She worked from noon until 5 o'clock every weekday afternoon in a shop that sold newspapers and sweets. That made things a lot easier for Mr. Hoppy. So, on the first exciting afternoon, after he had made sure that Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy went out onto his balcony armed with his long metal pole. He called this the tortoise catcher. He leaned over the balcony railings and lowered down the pole onto Mrs. Silver's balcony below. Alfie was basking in the pale sunlight over to one side. "Hello, Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "You are about to go for a little ride." He wiggled the tortoise catcher till it was right above Alfie. He pushed the hand lever so that the claws opened wide. Then he lowered the two claws neatly over Alfie's shell and pulled the lever. The claws closed tightly over the shell like 2 fingers of a hand. He hauled Alfie up onto his own balcony. It was easy. "He's kidnapped Alfie!" "Oh my goodness, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy weighed Alfie on his own kitchen scales just to make sure that Mrs. Silver's figure of 13 ounces was correct. It was. Now, holding Alfie in one hand, he picked his way carefully through his huge collection of tortoises to find one that first of all had the same colour shell as Alfie's, and secondly weighed exactly 2 ounces more. 2 ounces is not much. It is less than a smallish hen's egg. It is less than a smallish hen's egg weighs. But, you see, the important thing in Mr. Hoppy's plan was to make sure that the new tortoise was bigger than Alfie, but only a tiny bit bigger. The difference had to be so small that Mrs. Silver wouldn't notice. From his vast collection, it was not difficult for Mr. Hoppy to find just the tortoise he wanted. He wanted one that weighed 15 ounces exactly on his kitchen scales, no more and no less. And when he got it, he put it on the kitchen table beside Alfie, and even he could hardly tell that one was bigger than the other. But it was bigger. It was bigger by 2 ounces. This was tortoise number 2. Mr. Hoppy took tortoise number 2 out onto the balcony and gripped it in the claws of the tortoise catcher. Then he lowered it onto Mrs. Silver's balcony right beside a nice fresh lettuce. Tortoise number 2 had never eaten tender juicy lettuce leaves before. It had only had thick old cabbage leaves. It loved the lettuce and started chomping away at it with great gusto. There followed a rather nervous 2 hours wait for Mrs. Silver to return from work. Would she see any difference between the new tortoise and Alfie? It was going to be a tense moment. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. "Alfie, my darling!" she cried out. "Mummy's back. Have you missed me?" Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railings, but well hidden between 2 huge potted plants, held his breath. But the new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My, Alfie, you do seem hungry today," Mrs. Silver was saying. "It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you." Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very closely to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper. Esio Trot, Teg, Rebig, Regib, Emok, no, Esio Trot, Werg, Pot, Poo, Fruit, Poo, Toosh, Poo, Gnurps, Poo, Wald poo, loose poo, egrog, elzug, plug, tup-no taff, Esio Trot, tup-no taff, tegno, elbog, doof. That tortoise thinking, what's going on? What are you saying to me, crazy lady? Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, good evening, Mrs. Silver. How's Alfie tonight? Oh, he's lovely, Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. He's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words. You never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly. You never know. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. I've got it. Lovely. On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below, and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure the shells matched in colour. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, and I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. Will he get caught? So, this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, so there's Alfie, and he weighed 13 ounces. And at the end of the first week, there's tortoise number 2, and he's 15 ounces. Then at the end of the second week, there's tortoise number 3, and he weighed 17 ounces. Then at the end of the third week, here comes tortoise number 4, and he weighs 19 ounces. The end of the fourth week, there's tortoise number 5, 21 ounces. At the end of the 5th week, there's tortoise number 6, who weighs 23 ounces, and slowly but surely, they're getting a tiny bit bigger each week. At the end of the 6th week, tortoise number 7 is 25 ounces, and at the end of the 7th week, tortoise number 8 weighs 27 ounces. Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 11 was 27 ounces. Hang on, no, sorry, tortoise number 8. I'm thinking, what? Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. And we're going to leave it there for today, because I think that's a nice place to stop, because like we said last week, this book doesn't have chapters. And I think that will give us, we'll finish it next week. We're going to finish it there. Today, now that we've read the story and we can see the plan coming into play, we know what he's doing, we know what he's up to, don't we now? And he started his plan, and it's been going for 8 weeks. So what do you think is going to happen in the end? Next week is our final week of reading this book. Can you have an idea? Can you make a prediction? What is going to happen at the end of the story? Is Mr. Hoppy going to get away with it, or isn't he? Is Mrs. Silver going to notice? Is she going to demand that Alfie is returned to her immediately, or will Alfie never see Mrs. Silver again and he'll just live a life of tortoise partying with all his new mates? Right, I'm going to leave it there for now. What do you think? Let me know. You could record a little video of yourself on Seesaw telling me what your predictions are. If you like, you could say, Mrs. Warburton, I think Esio Trot will finish with, and tell me what you think can happen. I'd love to see those. Bye everyone, see you next week for our final reading of Esio Trot. Bye. Hang on, how do I end this thing? Oh yeah, there we go. Bye.